Welcome, dear listener. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Relax your shoulders. Let the soft, familiar sounds around you, the faint hum of the room, the distant night traffic, or perhaps the whisper of rain, calm you down. If you found your way here, it means you, like me, are drawn to silence. That special peace that comes when the world slows down and the past begins to breathe again. If you enjoy wandering through these forgotten hours of history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a gentle comment below. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Every little note, every word, like a faint echo in the bell tower of this shared space. Proof that someone else out there is hearing the same sound through time. So now, let's begin. Morning in a medieval city. Before the sun rises over the tiled roofs, before the baker opens the shutters, before the mist clears from the riverbanks, a single deep sound will sweep through the still air. The bell. It trembles once, as if breathing. Then again, low and even. A hum that settles in the bones of the houses, slipping between beams and stones. It wakes the pigeons on the church roof. It excites the dog in the alley. The sound seems to belong to no one, and yet to everyone. For in those centuries when clocks did not stand on towers or tick on walls, it was the bell that ruled over time. Its voice was iron and sky, fire and faith, forged by human hands, but somehow older than the people who listened to it. Imagine yourself there, standing barefoot on a narrow alley paved with uneven cobblestones. The mist clings to your hair. The air smells faintly of smoke and bread, of iron hinges and damp wood. And then the sound again, slow, rhythmic, patient. Bong, bong. You don't see the bell, just a shadowy tower above the rooftops. But you feel its presence. Its sound tells you what time it is. Though you may not know the number, you know what it means. Time to rise, to pray, to begin. Every city in medieval Europe had its bell, or several. They were not just musical instruments, but the voices of the community. When the bell spoke, it was as if the whole city had breathed its last. When it fell silent, even the birds seemed to stop. The bell told people when to wake up, when to rest, when to gather, when to grieve. It was a language learned not through words, but through rhythm and tone. One slow ringing meant death. A triple sequence meant fire. A quick, bright ringing meant a wedding. And the steady rhythm of the morning called everyone to prayer. In this first chapter, we focus not on drama, but on presence. The stillness of the early hours, when the sound of the bell drifts like a mist across the valley, connecting huts, fields, and hearts in one common pulse. It is said that people could distinguish one bell from another, even from villages many miles apart. A blacksmith in his forge might stop in the middle of a swing and say, "This is the bell of St. Mary," and no other. A shepherd on a hill could hear the echo and know which church it came from, what feast it was celebrating, and perhaps even which monk was ringing it. Each bell began with fire. The making of a bell was no ordinary craft, but almost a ritual, a combination of alchemy, prayer, and art. The bell maker, often a wandering man, traveled from town to town with his molds and crucibles. In a hollow dug near the cemetery, he built a furnace. The townspeople gathered to watch the metal transform into molten light. The bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, shone like a miniature sun. Sparks shot up, joining the stars. The air smelled of ash, clay, and heat. The founder, his face covered in soot, whispered a prayer as the molten stream poured into the mold. For weeks it cooled in the ground, silent and invisible, like a seed waiting to be born. And when the mold broke and a new bell emerged, the town gathered again to name it, to anoint it, to sanctify it with holy water. They treated it as a living being. The bells were baptized, given godparents, and even given names: Maria, Gabriel, Clara, Pax. In some records, the voice of the bell was described as male or female, bright or sad, clear or deep. When it was lifted up to the tower, often with the help of ropes, blocks, and human sweat, the people below rejoiced, for they knew that their new voice of time had been born. As dawn spread over the rooftops, the bell marked the Angelus. In monasteries and towns alike, it was the sound that divided night from day. 3 slow tolls, a pause, then 3 again, then 3 once more. Between each set, people crossed themselves, whispered a prayer, or simply stood still for a heartbeat. The rhythm carried through the streets, over thatched roofs, across gardens, and through open doors. In its wake, the town awakened gently. From the bakery came the scent of rye and yeast. From the stables, the sound of a sleepy horse shifting in straw. Somewhere, a child laughed, quickly hushed by a mother carrying a basket. Even the rivers seemed to move differently after the bells, as though their sound had ordered the world, settling it into its pattern. You might wonder, how did people tell time before watches and clocks? They listened. The bell told them what they needed to know. It marked not minutes or seconds, but moments that mattered. There was no rush to count, no anxious checking, only sound and rhythm rising and falling with the sun. At dawn, the Angelus. Mid-morning, the Prime. At noon, the 6th. In late afternoon, the Nun. And as dusk descended, the Vespers. The day was not measured, it was experienced. The bell was the heartbeat of this rhythm. Some chroniclers say that the townsfolk could sense the passage of time almost like weather, not as something strict and numeric, but as something felt. The bell's sound was like the changing light. It came when it was meant to, and all other things followed. To live in a medieval town was to live surrounded by bells. Each one spoke differently. The great bell of the cathedral, heavy, solemn, resonant, spoke to the entire valley. The smaller bells of parish churches had gentler tones, familiar, local, domestic. Monasteries used bells of ordered precision, their tones measured to accompany chanting and psalms. Even the humblest hamlet might have a single bell hanging from a wooden frame near the chapel. It might be cracked, weathered, leaning slightly, but its sound was known to all who lived within earshot. In some places, bells rang not only for humans, but for the fields. When storms gathered, farmers prayed for protection. They believed the ringing could chase away thunder, that demons feared the voice of sanctified metal. This belief was so strong that during tempests, bell ringers risked their lives climbing towers to sound their bells against the storm. Lightning struck many of them. Yet the faith persisted, that sound itself could purify air and ward off danger. Pause for a moment and imagine that sound again. It does not shout. It does not hurry. It rolls outward, slow as honey, filling space without demanding it. That is what medieval bells taught. That sound could be a form of peace, a bridge between silence and life. For those who lived then, the bell was not just a tool, it was the voice of the divine. It marked the boundary between the earthly and the sacred. A bell ringing in the morning told you that your day belonged partly to God, partly to your labor. A bell ringing in the evening told you that the world was being folded back into silence, as light faded behind the hills. And for those who were dying, the final bell, the passing bell, was the last sound they heard, a promise that even as one life ended, the rhythm of time continued. The world of bells was not only heard, but felt. The ground itself would hum faintly beneath the feet when the largest bells rang. Birds lifted from rooftops, windows trembled. Children covered their ears but laughed at the vibration in their chest. Old men sat quietly, eyes closed, counting the peals. In monasteries, monks practiced precise timing, their ringing synchronized to prayers and chants. In villages, the rhythm was looser, more human, sometimes imperfect. But imperfection was part of life's pulse. Imagine for a moment that you stand again in that street, the smell of smoke, the wet cobbles, the faint drizzle. The bell is ringing for prime. You lift your eyes. You cannot see the ringer, hidden high above. But you know him or her. You know their pattern, their strength, the slight hesitation between strokes. You can tell who is on duty just from the way the sound breathes. Such was the intimacy of sound in that age. Modern clocks tick evenly, impersonally. But bells breathe. Their sound expands, softens, fades, and lingers like mist in the corners of streets. And that echo, that slow dying of tone, was often more beautiful than the sound itself. Poets wrote that the echo of a bell was a kind of memory, a ghost of time that refused to end. To live in such a world was to live inside sound, to inhabit it as one might inhabit air. At midnight, the bell would toll again. The curfew. Its name comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. When it rang, townsfolk extinguished hearths, locked doors, and let darkness settle. The world shrank into quiet. And then, hours later, before dawn, it would begin anew. Thus, each day rose and fell between bells, a woven pattern of sound and silence. The first bells we know of were not Christian at all. Their ancestors were hammered plates in temples of Asia, bronze vessels in ancient China, votive chimes in Rome. But in medieval Europe, they took on a personality. They became human in a way no earlier instrument had. In chronicles, bells were said to speak, to weep, to rejoice. When one cracked, people mourned. When one was recast, they held a ceremony. And when invaders or reformers melted them into cannon, towns recorded the event as though a relative had died. So strong was the bond between people and bells that some towns hid theirs in wells or buried them in fields to save them from destruction. Centuries later, farmers still dug up fragments of old bells, half melted, still bearing faint inscriptions. Pax, Maria, ora pro nobis. Each bell told its own story. Some bore Latin phrases carved around their rim, prayers, invocations, or wishes for peace. Others carried marks of the foundry or symbols of saints. Their shapes were subtly different, some narrow and tall, others wide and low. Each had a unique timbre, a voice born from its proportions and the precise mix of metals. When a town suffered famine or plague, it was the bell that announced each passing soul. The people would pause whatever they were doing, bow their heads, and whisper a prayer. The bell was thus the storyteller of the town, not in words, but in sound. It marked births, deaths, disasters, and joys. It was the audible diary of the community. You may still hear it echoing, that first morning bell, rolling over rooftops and fields. But before it could ever sound its voice into the sky, it had to be born. And its birth was not of flesh, nor of water, but of fire. Tonight, we will travel backward, beneath the tower, into the soil and heat, to the place where every bell began, the foundry. Bell founders in the Middle Ages were wanderers, half artisans, half alchemists, and part priest. They moved from town to town, with carts full of clay molds, iron tongs, and a small traveling furnace, sometimes drawn by oxen, sometimes by hand. They had no permanent homes. for their work was always summoned anew, wherever a town wished for a new voice in its sky. Imagine the arrival of such a man in a quiet medieval square. The townsfolk gather curiously, the children peeking from behind aprons, the smiths nodding respectfully. He speaks little, his hands blackened with old soot. His clothes smell faintly of smoke and tallow. He chooses a flat patch of ground, often near the churchyard, where consecrated soil and sacred intention meet, and begins to dig. Over the next few days, he builds his workshop entirely from the earth itself. A pit lined with bricks and clay, a trench for the casting channel, and a dome of mud that will serve as the mold. It is a humble cathedral of dirt, but one soon to hold molten light. The bell's form begins not in bronze, but in clay. The founder constructs 3 layers, each more sacred than the last. First, he builds the core, a rough bell-shaped mound of brick, clay, and horsehair, slightly smaller than the final bell will be. Over it, he lays a false bell, made of wax or soft clay, shaped exactly as the bell will appear, down to its smooth curve and slender lip. Upon this layer, he carefully engraves every detail. Inscriptions, floral borders, the names of saints or donors, even small faces of angels. When the design is perfect, he covers it with another coat of clay. The mantle, when hardened, the whole structure looks like an earthen egg, tall and silent in its pit. Then comes the act of burning away the false bell. Fires are lit around the mold, slowly heating it until the wax melts and runs out through small holes. It is both destruction and creation, the sacrifice of form to make space for sound. In the hollow left behind, the true bell will soon be born. The ingredients of a medieval bell were as ancient as the stars, copper and tin, melted together into bronze. Each town guarded its mixture like a secret recipe. Some added small fragments of silver or coins, believing it would purify the tone. Others mixed in old metal relics, broken candlesticks, worn crucifixes, even bits of earlier bells, as if the new voice must carry the memory of the old. When all was ready, the founder prepared the melting. Charcoal fires burned day and night, roaring softly in the pit. The air shimmered with heat. Sparks rose into the dark like fleeting souls. Men stood near with long iron rods, stirring the molten mass. The founder would watch its surface keenly, reading it like scripture. If the color was too pale, the mix was weak. If too red, the bell would be brittle. He waited until the bronze glowed like the heart of the sun. Neither liquid nor solid, alive with slow movement. Then, he whispered a short prayer. Bells were rarely cast by daylight. Tradition favored night, the hour when noise and wind calmed, and even fire seemed to breathe more steadily. The town might gather quietly beyond a wooden fence. Children perched on shoulders, the glow of torches painting their faces gold. The founder, stripped to his shirt, took the long iron ladle, and when he nodded, his helpers opened the crucible. A river of fire spilled forth. It hissed and shone, reflecting in the founder's eyes. He guided it carefully into the mold's narrow throat, the molten stream flowing downward into darkness. The pit filled with light, then slowly dimmed. As the last of the bronze disappeared, silence followed. No one spoke. No one moved. They knew that inside that pit, a voice was forming. A voice that would one day speak to all of them. The founder made the sign of the cross. The watchers bowed their heads. And for hours afterward, the pit glowed faintly, like a buried ember of the sun. The next stage was not action, but patience. For days, sometimes weeks, the bell was left to cool in the earth. Each night, the founder visited the pit alone, listening to the faint cracks and sighs of cooling metal. he would lay his hand on the mound and whisper, "Rest now. The air will give you breath." In the town, the people went about their work, but kept glancing toward the churchyard. When smoke rose from the foundry pit, they crossed themselves, for they believed that the bell's soul was being tempered there, that in the fire, heaven and earth had touched. Mothers brought their children to look upon the place, telling them softly, "When it speaks, remember this night." When at last the time came to open the pit, it was treated as a sacred unveiling. The founders stood at dawn with hammer and chisel. The mantle was cracked open piece by piece, flakes of clay falling away to reveal the gleam beneath. And there, still dull from soot and dust, but unmistakably beautiful, lay the new bell. It bore inscriptions now hardened in bronze, perhaps Ave Maria or In Nomine Domini. Its surface shimmered faintly like old gold. The townsfolk gathered. Some touched it with reverent fingers. Children pressed their ears close, as if they might already hear the voice sleeping inside. It was lifted carefully from the ground, with ropes and beams, the creak of wood and groan of strain echoing through the square. And as sunlight broke over it, the founder smiled for the first time. He had done this many times before, yet each time felt like the first. For in every bell, he said, lives a soul of fire, never the same twice. Before a bell was ever rung, it was baptized. The ceremony resembled that of a human child. Priests and vestments approached with holy water and incense. They anointed the bell with oil, marked it with a cross, and named it aloud. Clara, or Johanna, or Benedicta. They prayed that its voice would drive away storms, bless the harvest, comfort the dying, and call the living to prayer. The townspeople responded with Amen. Then musicians played softly, flutes perhaps, or viols. And the founder himself struck the bell once with a padded mallet. The note was uncertain at first, a trembling hum, as though the bell were still waking from sleep. But when it settled into resonance, the crowd sighed, for the town had gained a new heart. Lifting a bell to the tower was an event of equal wonder. Few machines existed to help, so ropes, pulleys, and muscle were the only means. The men hauled, heaving in rhythm, chanting between pulls. The bell, wrapped in cloth and straw, rose slowly through the air, swaying like a cradle. Children ran beneath, mothers shouted warnings, and somewhere an old man began to pray. When at last it reached the belfry, workers guided it into its wooden frame. The yoke. They secured the clapper, adjusted the fittings, and tested the swing. And when everything was ready, they waited for the sign to ring it, not yet for time, but for thanksgiving. At the first great swing, the bell's sound broke like dawn itself, a single, perfect tone rolling through valleys and over the hills. The people below stopped where they stood, the baker, the shepherd, the tailor. Each lifted their head. The bell spoke its first word, and in that moment, everyone felt the same quiet awe. It was not merely sound, it was belonging. After the ceremony, the founder often left at once. He packed his tools, received his pay, and moved on to the next town. But before leaving, he always did one private thing. He would climb to the belfry alone, place his hand on the new bell's rim, and whisper, "Speak well, my friend." Speak kindly to them, then he would descend, vanish into the road. And weeks later, somewhere miles away, he might hear that same voice again, faint on the wind. For the bells of the medieval world spoke to one another. Their echoes met over forests and rivers, carrying greetings from town to town. To the founder, that was comfort enough, to know that his work still lived, singing through distance and time. It is easy now, surrounded by the quiet hum of electric clocks, to forget what it meant to entrust one's hours to a voice born of flame. Yet for centuries, this was the heartbeat of human rhythm, a reminder that all creation begins with transformation. The clay must burn away to make space for sound. The metal must melt to find its form. The craftsman must let go so that others may listen. Perhaps that is why the making of bells carried such reverence, because it mirrored life itself, a pattern of shaping, surrendering, and becoming. Not every casting succeeded. Sometimes the mold cracked, sometimes air trapped inside the bronze left hollows that spoiled the tone. When that happened, the founder would stand in silence before the ruined shell. He did not curse. He only murmured, "It did not wish to be born." The failed bell was melted down again, its voice unborn but not lost. Its spirit, he said, would wait for the next casting. And so, through trial and patience, the bells that finally survived carried more than metal. They carried forgiveness, the quiet persistence of those who tried again and again to shape perfection from imperfection. When all was finished, the bell tower stood silent for one night. The new bell hung motionless, suspended in darkness, the air still faintly scented with tar and oak. Far below, candles flickered in the streets. A few children still whispered stories of the glowing pit that had birthed their town's new voice. Then came midnight, and the first toll. The ringer, careful and slow, pulled the rope once. The bell answered with a sound unlike any other, clear, newborn, but ancient too, as though it had waited centuries to speak. That note spread outward, over sleeping fields, through forests, along rivers. And in cottages far away, people stirred in their beds, half dreaming, half awake, comforted by the sound of something both human and eternal. So it was that each bell was not just an object, but a moment in time made solid. Every ring we hear today, faint in the distance, carried by wind, is the echo of that ancient union between fire and faith. The founder's hands, long turned to dust, still live through the tone he shaped. The clay he burned, the prayers he whispered, the names he inscribed, all are present in that single, trembling sound that fills the air when a bell speaks. It is easy to forget that such beauty once required such heat. But the medieval world knew, without fire, there is no music. Before the sky turns from indigo to gray, before birds begin to stir in their nests, a low hum rises from the church tower. It is not sudden, nor loud, rather, it trembles gently, like breath exhaled into the cold morning. The bell. It speaks again. 3 measured notes, a pause, then 3 again. Those who are awake make the sign of the cross. Those still half asleep murmur the words by instinct. Ave Maria, Gratia plena. This is the Angelus, the prayer of dawn. It marks not only the beginning of day, but the beginning of awareness, when the body and the soul both open to movement. The medieval morning was not rushed. There were no alarms, no whistles, no iron schedules. Instead, time unfolded in soft layers. Darkness thinning, fires rekindled, footsteps on the cobblestones. And above it all, the bell calling the world to order. In the small towns of France, in the misty villages of England, in the walled cities of Italy, the scene was much the same. Somewhere, the tower loomed above roofs of red tile or gray slate. Its bell waited, heavy but patient, until the ringer climbed the narrow spiral stair, lantern in hand, rope coiled over his shoulder. At the top he paused, for even he was part of the ritual. He leaned from the window, feeling the cool air on his face, the scent of night's fading dew. Below, he saw nothing but a pale suggestion of streets and chimneys. Then he took the rope in both hands and pulled. The sound rolled outward, down the tower's stone ribs, through wooden beams, out into the town square, the river, the fields beyond. It was as if the world itself had been struck gently on its heart. The Angelus was more than a signal. It was a rhythm of faith repeated 3 times a day, at dawn, at noon, and at dusk. But it was the morning one that carried the greatest tenderness, for it reminded the people of beginning, of creation renewed. In every place where it was heard, people paused their hands. A shepherd leaning on his staff, a woman drawing water from the well, a child stirring awake beneath woolen covers. They whispered the words of the angel's greeting to Mary, remembering that even the divine began with a moment of listening. 3 tolls, a silence. 3 tolls, another silence. 3 tolls more, and the air grew still. Afterward, the sound lingered like breath on glass. The day, from that moment, belonged to the living again. In many medieval towns, the bell was the first light. Before sunrise, windows were shuttered, streets unlit. The world was still dark. Yet the bell's sound cut through the shadow like a thread of gold. It reached into narrow alleys where cats slinked between barrels. It touched the river's surface, rippling faintly. It woke the baker, who stirred his coals and began to knead. It nudged the monks in the cloister, who rose from their pallets to chant matins. Even those too tired to rise still heard it and knew. The world is turning, and you are part of it. This was time not told by numbers, but by sensations, a harmony between sound and light. The first toll might coincide with the paling of stars. By the second, roosters began to crow. By the last, a faint orange rim touched the eastern sky. Time was thus not counted but experienced. A symphony of small awakenings. In monasteries, the Angelus blended with another rhythm. The divine office, prayers that divided the entire day into sacred intervals. The first, matins, was said deep in the night, lauds at dawn. The bell that called monks from their cells was smaller than those of towns, often hung within the cloister or struck by hand on a suspended plate called a cymbalum. Imagine the sound, not loud but pure, echoing through stone corridors, meeting the shuffle of sandaled feet. The brothers filed silently into the chapel, their breath misting in the cold air. There the chanting began, slow, steady, almost identical to the rhythm of the bell itself. The words of the psalms rose upward with the faint scent of incense drifting to the rafters, then outward through open doors into the sleeping countryside. Outside, farmers still slept, unaware that their own day would soon begin under the same tones. The bells of the monastery were not just instruments of sound. They were extensions of the monastic soul. Each note, precise and measured, kept the rhythm of eternity alive. In the village beyond the walls, the same sound carried differently. It was muffled by fog, softened by distance, but still recognizable. When it reached the baker's window, he smiled. When it reached the miller's hut, he turned the wheel. Cocks crowed, dogs barked, doors opened with the groan of old wood. The first carts rolled through the streets, their wheels crunching straw and pebbles. The bell was not only prayer, it was permission. Permission to begin, to speak, to work, to live. Women stepped out with baskets on their arms, heading toward the well. Men gathered tools, scythes, hammers, spades, while greeting each other softly, their voices carrying in the morning air. Children chased chickens in the courtyard, laughing between echoes. The world had resumed its pulse. And still, above all, the bell continued, slow and deliberate, its rhythm neither hurried nor prolonged. just enough to be felt like a heartbeat beneath everything else. Bells had an uncanny way of finding paths unseen. Their tones traveled through walls, slid across rooftops, skipped along rivers. On damp mornings, sound carried farther. On windy ones, it bent and curved. In valleys, echoes folded back upon themselves, so that a single peal seemed to multiply into many. Travelers walking along distant roads could tell the landscape's shape by the sound of bells. One clear and high, another muffled, another faintly delayed. It was like hearing the geography sing. The bell at dawn was thus a kind of map, not drawn, but heard. It told those far away where they were, how near or far from home, how close to human company. And to the lonely shepherd in the hills, its voice was not just sound, but solace. As the Angelus faded, other bells began, lighter, quicker, practical. These were the market bells. In larger towns, they rang after the morning prayer to announce that the day's trade could begin. The gates opened. Farmers with carts of hay and onions entered through the archways. Merchants lifted the shutters of their stalls. The air filled with other sounds now. Hoofbeats, voices, the thud of sacks on tables. But beneath it all, the memory of the morning bell lingered. It gave rhythm to the chaos, like a deep note that keeps the melody steady. Even as the world grew busy, the sense of order remained. The people might not have noticed it consciously, but in their movements, in the way they spoke, sold, bartered, or blessed, one could sense they were still moving to the same pulse that had begun with the Angelus. For the baker, dawn was never silent. He worked beside his small oven, the glow of the fire still red from the night before. Flour drifted in the air like snow. Each loaf he shaped felt like part of the same ritual. Dough pressed, folded, and left to rise. While outside, the bell continued to sound its slow good morning. He did not look at the sky. He listened. When the last toll faded, he knew how much longer before sunrise. Enough time to bake the first batch before the market opened. To him, and to countless like him, the bell was a clock of the heart. Its voice told him everything his day required: when to light the fire, when to knead, when to deliver. He had never seen a watch, but he never missed an hour. Beyond the town walls, the bell still reached, carried by the wind across meadows where dew glistened on grass. Farmers paused mid-step, leaning on their tools. Cows lifted their heads. A fisherman untied his boat from a wooden post and pushed into the current, the oar dipping silently. The sound of the bell met the sound of water, and together they made something both earthly and divine, a blending of labor and prayer. For the medieval world, there was no division between sacred and mundane. The bell that called one to worship was the same that marked the start of plowing or sowing. Its sound belonged equally to monks and to mud-stained peasants. In that way, the bell was the most democratic voice of all. For children, the morning bell was both a teacher and a lullaby. They learned its meanings before they learned to read. They could tell by tone whether it was calling to prayer or warning of fire. They played games imitating its rhythm, clapping hands or striking sticks. Some claimed that if you stood under the bell tower and looked up at the exact moment the Angelus began, you could make a wish that would surely come true. Others said you must never speak during the toll, lest the angels mistake your words for prayer. Superstitions and innocence blended seamlessly, as they always did in the Middle Ages. Faith worn as comfortably as breath. Far above all this, above the roofs, above the mist, stood the ringer. He was often alone, high in the wooden cage of the tower, surrounded by beams darkened by centuries of smoke and dust. Through the narrow windows, he saw the world awaken. not in detail, but as movement. Smoke rising from chimneys, small dots becoming people, birds scattering like thoughts. When he pulled the rope, he felt resistance, as if the world itself weighed against him. But then the bell moved, slowly at first, then freely. Its swing made the tower tremble. Dust drifted down in lazy spirals of sunlight. He smiled. It was not pride, but quiet satisfaction, knowing that below, thousands were beginning their day to the sound of his work. He had no need for words. The bell spoke for him. After the final note, there was silence. A deep, breathing silence that seemed even louder for the absence of sound. This was perhaps the most beautiful moment of all. The space after the ringing, when the air still trembled faintly, as if remembering. People resumed their motions. Doors opened, footsteps began, animals stirred. But for a short while, everything seemed aligned, balanced, unhurried. That is what the morning bell did best. It tuned the world, like a string drawn back into harmony. The day, for the medieval world, was not measured in minutes. It was measured in moments of devotion, each one marked by sound, a slow, steady pulse from tower to valley. In a time before the ticking of clocks, the world itself was the timepiece. The sun rose, and people rose. The sun fell, and people slept. Between these two certainties, the bell divided the day into smaller circles, hours not of precision, but of purpose. To the monks who lived within stone walls, these divisions were sacred. To the townsfolk beyond, they were comforting, a reminder that even if life was chaotic, heaven's rhythm never faltered. There were 8 canonical hours, 8 breaths of time that gave shape to the day. Each one had its own bell, its own light, its own silence. Let us walk through them slowly, as one might walk through a garden of sound. It begins in darkness. While most of the world sleeps, the monastery stirs. A small handbell rings softly through the dormitory, and the monks rise without speech. They move like shadows through the corridor, the flame of a single lamp flickering against the stone. In the chapel they gather, and the great bell tolls once, twice, a slow, hollow sound that falls into the still air. Matins is the hour of watching, the time when the world lies between yesterday and tomorrow. The prayers spoken here are not hurried. They stretch like the night itself. The psalms echo through the empty halls, each voice blending with the next until they sound less like men and more like the breathing of time. Outside, nothing stirs. Even the stars seem to listen. When the prayers of matins end, silence returns. But soon, faint light touches the horizon, a line of gray between heaven and earth. The bell sounds again, higher, brighter. Lauds, the hour of praise. Here the monks sing of light, of renewal, of the coming day. Their chant rises like birdsong before the birds awake. The cold air glows faintly with incense. Windows darken with the faint blue of dawn. The rhythm of their voices matches the rhythm of breath, of heartbeats, of the world preparing to awaken. By the time the final psalm is sung, the first rays of sun have entered the chapel through narrow glass. The world has turned once more toward life. Now the town begins to move. Doors creak open, hearths are kindled, carts roll across cobblestones. The bell of prime rings, the first working hour. It is not loud or ceremonial, but steady and confident, like the voice of someone clearing their throat before speaking. This is the hour for beginnings, of work, of trade, of learning. In monasteries, the bell calls monks to their labors, to the scriptorium, to the gardens, to the kitchens. In towns, it calls craftsmen to open their shutters, apprentices to sweep floors, women to fetch water, farmers to harness oxen. Prime is the bridge between sacred time and human time, between the prayer and the plow. The bell that marks it is often warm in tone, its echoes spreading through mist and chimney smoke. To hear it was to know the day has truly begun. 3 hours later, another bell. Its sound is gentler, reflective. It marks terce, the 3rd hour after sunrise. For monks, this was the time of the Holy Spirit's descent at Pentecost, the flame of inspiration. For townsfolk, it was mid-morning, the hour when labor found its rhythm. The smith's hammer rang in time with the bell, the washerwoman's rhythm at the stream followed its cadence. It was as though every motion found a beat beneath the sound. The sun climbed higher, shadows shortened. And though the world was busy, no one forgot to listen. Terce reminded them, even in labor, there was holiness. By noon, the air shimmered with heat, and the bell for sext rang. Its voice was clear but unhurried, a bell that neither startled nor demanded. This was the hour of rest, when fields fell silent, and hands paused their work. In monasteries, monks gathered again in the chapel. In towns, people stopped to pray briefly, or at least to lift their heads toward the sound. For many, sext marked the midday meal. Bread and cheese, perhaps a bowl of stew, water drawn cool from the well. Even in the busiest cities, a hush followed this bell. It was not just the sound that calmed, but the knowing that somewhere, everywhere, others were pausing too. The entire landscape, for a few moments, inhaled and exhaled together. The air softens. Dust glows golden in sunbeams. The bell rings again. Slower now. Deeper. This is none. The 9th hour after sunrise. The word survives in our modern noon, though the time is shifted. In the monasteries, it was the hour of reflection, when minds grew tired and hearts turned again toward silence. In the fields, it was the hour of gathering tools. In the markets, it signaled the beginning of closure, the winding down of commerce. To many, none sounded like a gentle farewell, the soft turning of day toward its end. Its tone was often low, almost melancholic, like sunlight fading on stone. Evening approaches, and once again, the bell's voice changes. It is richer now, almost golden. A sound that seems to glow as much as it rings. Vespers, the most beloved of the hours. The monks gather once more in the fading light, their shadows long on the chapel floor. Candles flicker, the scent of wax mingles with that of worn wood and damp stone. The chants are slower, warmer, filled with gratitude rather than urgency. Outside, townsfolk too pause. Farmers returning from fields lift their caps. Women at doorways look toward the steeple. Children cease their play. For centuries, Vespers marked the hour of homecoming, the world folding back upon itself after labor. And when the final note of the bell fades, a deep peace settles over the land. Finally, the day exhales. The bell for Compline rings softly in the dark, its sound more lullaby than summons. It tells the monks to extinguish their lamps, to whisper their last prayers, to close their eyes. It tells the townsfolk to lower their shutters, to bank the fire, to draw loved ones close. It is the hour of trust, when the world hands itself back to night. In monasteries, the words of the final hymn rise gently. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. The same words many would later say at the moment of death. Thus, the closing of each day was a rehearsal for eternity. Peaceful, unafraid. Each of these hours was a note, and together they made a melody. A music of life that required no instrument, but sound and silence. From the first darkness of matins to the last whisper of compline, the bells stitched time together. The poor and the noble, the pious and the weary, all shared the same rhythm. Even those who could not read or write could still read the day through sound. They knew its shape by ear, the rising tones of morning, the mellow voice of noon, the slow tolling of evening. It was, in a way, the first shared language of Europe, the language of hours. Today, we no longer hear such hours. Clocks whisper constantly, watches glow silently on our wrists, phones vibrate without voice. Yet, in rare places, mountain villages, old abbeys, hidden towns, the bells still speak. And when they do, their language is unchanged. They do not tell us what to do. They remind us simply to be. Their sound says, the world still breathes. Time is still sacred. You too belong within the pattern. There are sounds that comfort, the slow toll of dawn, the soft chime of vespers. And then there are sounds that pierce the stillness like lightning. The warning bell. Its cry begins the same way, bronze against air. But the rhythm is different. Where the Angelus was steady, this one is urgent. Where Vespers was calm, this one trembles. It is not music, but signal, a language of fear learned by every ear. And yet, even here, within danger and alarm, there is something sacred. For in those moments when the bell rang out against chaos, it was the only voice that stood between the people and the unknown. Imagine it is midnight in a small medieval town. The streets are quiet, torches extinguished, dogs sleeping in doorways. Above, clouds drift thick and low, pressing against the roofs. Then suddenly, a sound, shrill, uneven, unmistakable, cuts through the dark. Ding, 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 ding. Short, fast, desperate. The bell of St. Martin's Tower is ringing not for prayer, but for fire. Within seconds, doors fling open. Men and women rush into the streets, half-dressed, carrying buckets. From one house rises smoke, then flame, orange and alive against the black sky. The bell does not stop. It swings with violent rhythm, the ringer below pulling the rope with all his strength, sweat dripping though the night is cold. The sound spreads like wind, reaching the next street, the river, the mill, and the farthest farm beyond the gate. Each peal says the same thing. Come, help, wake. In a world without sirens, the bell was the heartbeat of alarm. Its urgency could raise an entire town within moments. Its echo alone was enough to save lives. The bell used for fire was not the same as that for prayer. It had a harsher voice, often cracked or smaller in size, chosen for its ability to cut through noise. In many towns, it hung in a separate tower, sometimes over the gate, sometimes on a wooden frame in the square. It was called the toque de feu in France, the Feuerglocke in Germany, the fire bell in England. When smoke was seen, the watchman, often a sleepy guard or a boy in the tower, pulled the rope with all his might. The bell answered in a pattern everyone knew, short, fast, repeating. It meant, fire has found us. Come now. And though fear spread with it, so too did a kind of unity. Neighbors ran together, passing buckets, breaking doors, rescuing children. The bell's sound filled the air with both dread and determination. Long after the flames were out, its echo still lingered in the mind, like a phantom heartbeat. Not all dangers came from human hands. Some came from the sky itself. When dark clouds gathered and thunder cracked, monks and villagers alike ran to their towers. They believed that sound could drive away storms, that the sanctified voice of a bell could scatter lightning. This was not mere superstition, it was ritual. The bell, having been baptized and anointed, was considered a vessel of divine protection. When it rang, angels listened. So even as thunder rolled, the bell rang louder. There are old accounts of ringers struck by lightning mid-prayer, their hands still clutched to the ropes, their faces turned toward heaven. And yet the practice continued for centuries, passed from father to son, as if courage itself were hereditary. Each storm that passed left behind not only fear, but reverence. For sound that could challenge the sky, for men who would climb towers in the rain, for the voice that did not falter when others did. Then there were the bells of war. These were not the clear tones of morning or the soft farewell of evening. They were deep, violent, unrelenting, a roar of iron that shook the air itself. When armies approached, when riders brought word of invasion, the bells began. They rang in bursts, not measured but wild, sometimes joined by every church in the region, until the land itself seemed to tremble. In France, this sound was called the tocsin, from toquer le signe, to strike the signal. In England, they said, the alarm bell rings. But everywhere, the meaning was the same. Danger is near. Men seized weapons. Women gathered children. Priests carried relics to safety. The town, for a moment, became a single body, pulsing to the same desperate rhythm. But there were darker moments still, when the bells were taken. When armies invaded, one of the first things they did was silence the towers. They cut the ropes, shattered the clappers, or melted the bells into cannon. The same bronze that had once called to prayer was reborn as weapon, its pure tone transformed into iron thunder. In chronicles of the 100 Years' War, there are notes of towns mourning their bells like the dead. One monk wrote, "When the tower was empty, it was as though the soul of our town had gone mute." For centuries after, people could still recall the tone that had once filled their valley. Its pitch, its echo, even the way it vibrated in their chest. The silence left behind was unbearable. The ringer, the one who climbed the tower, was both hero and ghost. He was often the first to act when danger came. When fire spread or armies advanced, others ran to hide, but he ran upward. The tower was no refuge. Wind, flame, and arrow all reached it. Yet he climbed, rope in hand, knowing his task. To ring was to risk death, but not to ring was to doom the town. Chroniclers tell of ringers shot through by arrows, still clutching the rope as the bell swung above them. Their final act became the town's salvation. Later generations carved their names on the tower walls, not as martyrs, but as reminders of duty. In those towers, courage had a sound. Not all warnings were of danger from without. Some came from within, the quiet toll of death. When someone died, especially during times of plague or war, the bell spoke again. But now, it did not rush or roar. It moved slowly, one long toll, then silence. Each note seemed to fall through the air like a stone sinking through water. People counted the strokes to know who had passed. A certain pattern for a man, another for a woman, another still for a child. In some towns, the bell rang once for every year of life. It was said that if you listened closely, you could feel the soul ascending with the echo. The same bell that had once cried in alarm now whispered of release. After such days, after fire or war or plague, the tower would sometimes stand silent for weeks. The rope hung limp, dust gathered on the beams, birds nested in the rafters. But the people remembered. When peace returned and the bell finally rang again, the sound was not mere sound. It was survival. It meant, we are still here. It meant, the tower stands. The voice endures. Every note carried within it the weight of what had been lost, and the promise that life, despite all, would continue. In later centuries, Bells followed armies themselves. Portable field bells hung from wagons or chapel tents, ringing before battle or at funerals afterward. Even amid cannon fire, their chimes could be heard faintly, a fragile sound among the roar. Officers noted how soldiers would fall silent at the sound, crossing themselves before the charge. For an instant, the battlefield felt like a church again. The bell did not command victory. It reminded men of humanity. The memory of those warning bells never truly faded. In village folklore, they became omens. Some said that on quiet nights, you could still hear them ringing from drowned towns, buried towers, or across fog-covered moors, ghostly tolls warning of storms yet to come. Sailors believed that phantom bells rang beneath the sea before shipwrecks. Farmers swore they heard faint tones on the wind before war returned. Whether superstition or memory, it did not matter. The sound of alarm had imprinted itself into the human spirit, a reminder that even fear can carry beauty when it comes from shared survival. One for joy, bright, bounding, full of life, and one for sorrow, slow, measured, echoing through the ribs of the world. In the medieval town, these voices shaped the very seasons of living. They announced when love began, when a child drew its first breath, when a soul departed. They sang for markets, feasts, and coronations, and they mourned for plague, famine, and loss. To live under the sound of bells was to live surrounded by presence, the constant reminder that life, whether sweet or bitter, was always being witnessed by the sky. Let us begin with joy. It is spring in a small stone village. The air smells of rain and lilac. Garlands of flowers hang from windows, and the square is alive with murmuring. The church doors are open, spilling candlelight into the morning. Inside, the priest waits at the altar, a smile softening his lined face. And above, in the tower, two young ringers grasp the ropes. They have been waiting for this moment all week. Their palms are powdered with chalk, their sleeves rolled, their eyes shining with the nervous energy of celebration. When the first kiss is shared, they pull together, and the bells begin. The sound bursts through the air like light. It rolls over rooftops, scattering pigeons, glides across fields where shepherds look up and smile. The bells of marriage are not heavy. They dance, quick, ringing, alive. Each peal a blessing, each echo a wish for fruitfulness and peace. To the newly married couple, that sound is not just music, it is the town's voice itself, rejoicing with them. The rhythm changes as the procession leaves the church. The bells swing faster, higher, playful now, their notes chasing one another like laughter down the lanes. Children clap their hands, old women throw herbs into the air, men raise mugs in salute. And when at last the sound begins to fade, the air feels strangely lighter, as though even the buildings themselves had smiled. A quieter joy comes with birth. When a new child was born, especially after a long night of labor, the family sent word to the church. And soon, the small bell, the Sanctus bell, light and silvery, would ring. It rang not to summon a crowd, but to announce that life had arrived. Its notes fell soft as water, each one like a tiny hand pressing gently upon the heart. The bell marked not only a new life, but a new responsibility for all who heard it. For in the medieval world, every birth was communal, a promise that the town too had gained a new soul to protect. At the christening, the priest dipped the child into water, blessed by candlelight. The parents and godparents traced crosses in the air. And outside, once again, the bell sounded, a pure, single tone that rose like a sigh toward heaven. No one who heard it could mistake its meaning. It was the smallest bell in the tower, yet it carried more hope than any other. beyond weddings and births, were the bells of feasts. Days when work stopped, markets closed, and people filled the streets with color. The great feast of Easter, the Nativity, the Assumption, and 100 local saints' days. Each had its own melody. The ringers trained for days to prepare patterns of joy, triplets, cascades, overlapping tones that turned the air into music. When all the bells of a town rang together, large, small, cracked, perfect, it was as though the earth itself had become an instrument. The vibration could be felt through the chest and fingertips. Even those who could not dance felt compelled to move. In those moments, there was no divide between sacred and human delight. The bells were laughter made holy. Travelers passing through such towns wrote that they could hear the celebration from miles away, the sound tumbling across valleys like the laughter of giants. And when the bells ceased, the silence that followed was as satisfying as rest after song. But the same towers that rang for life also rang for death. When someone neared their end, a single bell tolled from the church. 3 times it spoke softly, slowly, announcing to all that a soul was preparing to leave. This was called the passing bell. Its sound was low, deliberate, and strangely calm. It carried neither panic nor despair, only acknowledgement. Those who heard it paused whatever they were doing. Farmers set down their tools. Merchants folded their hands. Even children fell silent, sensing the weight in the air. They whispered prayers for the dying. The sick, hearing it from their beds, sometimes smiled, knowing they were not alone in their hour. When death came, the bell tolled again. Slower now, each strike separated by long intervals of silence. The spaces between notes were as meaningful as the notes themselves. And afterward, when the funeral procession began, the bell followed them all the way to the churchyard, its tone bending with the wind, its echo mingling with the chants of the living. At funerals, the bell spoke not only of loss, but of return. In many places, 2 bells were used, a smaller one that began the service, and a great one that marked the final departure. As the coffin left the church, the bells swung with heavy rhythm, each sound slower than the last, a gradual letting go. The mourners walked in silence except for that sound. It filled the spaces words could not. Somewhere in the crowd, a child might cry, and even that seemed folded into the rhythm, as though the bell were cradling both the beginning and the end of life at once. The bell did not mourn. It accompanied. It did not comfort by denial, but by constancy. It said, "Life goes on, and I will speak for those who no longer can." During the years of plague, those black seasons when half of Europe seemed to vanish, the bells worked without rest. In some towns, they tolled so often that people no longer asked who had died, only whether anyone still lived. The sound became part of the air, a continuous pulse of grief that blurred the days together. And yet, even then, the bell retained dignity. Its voice never broke. It did not weep. It endured. Monks wrote that during the plague of 1348, the only thing more constant than death was the sound of the bells. Even when the towers were emptied, a lone survivor might climb to ring them once more, to remind heaven that humanity was still listening. In that sense, the bell was both elegy and defiance, proof that sound could stand where bodies fell. Through centuries of feasts and funerals, the bell remained the most faithful witness of all. It saw joy and sorrow in equal measure. It heard laughter echoing in the square, then the same voices trembling in prayer days later. Its memory was longer than any human's. When one generation died, another came to the same tower, and the bell greeted them with the same tone, unchanged, unaging, eternal. To many, it felt almost alive. They called it our old friend, the voice of God, the heart of stone and air. They believed that each bell knew the stories of its town, the lovers it had blessed, the children it had baptized, the soldiers it had farewelled. When the ringer pulled the rope, he was not merely making sound, he was awakening memory. In medieval thought, sound was the closest thing to spirit. You could not see it or hold it, yet it could move you, lift you, even change you. The bell's vibration, they said, was the resonance of heaven made audible on earth. That is why it accompanied every turning of life, birth, love, death, so that the invisible might be touched by something tangible. When the bell rang for the dead, people believed the soul followed its sound upward, rising through layers of air like an echo returning to its source. And when it rang for marriage, the same tone bound two lives together, not with rope or signature, but with vibration shared by everyone who heard it. The bell was thus the unseen hand that wove community together. Without it, life felt unmeasured, unblessed adrift. Just as the bell marked the hours of the day, so it marked the seasons of the year. At harvest, it called workers to fields heavy with grain. At Christmas, it sang over snow. At Easter, it broke its own silence after Lent, a sound so joyous that people wept. Each season had its tone, high and crisp in spring, bright and fast in summer, deep and reflective in autumn, muffled and slow in winter. People did not need calendars. They heard the year in the way the bell was rung. If the bell was the voice of the town, then the bell ringer was its heartbeat. Hidden from sight, often nameless, he lived suspended between the earth that built the tower and the heaven whose air his bells would fill. To ring a bell was not a single act. It was a craft, a devotion, a partnership between man, rope, and bronze. Every tone that drifted through the valley began first with the rhythm of his breath. The bell ringer's day began before the rest of the town stirred. He rose when the world was still dark, when frost clung to the windows, and the only sound was the sigh of wind through the eaves. His tools were simple: a rope of coarse hemp, a pair of gloves, a lantern, and the long memory of rhythm learned from years of listening. He would step quietly into the church, the air cool, smelling of wax and old wood, and begin the climb. The stairs wound upward, stone first, then timber, then narrow planks. Each step creaked beneath him like a whisper. As he rose, the sound of the outside world faded. No street noise reached this height. Only the soft flutter of pigeons nesting in the rafters, and the faint hum of wind slipping through the louvers. At last, he reached the bell chamber, a wooden cage surrounding a giant of bronze, its lip darkened by centuries of dust, its clapper resting still like a sleeping heart. He paused there, lantern raised, and for a moment, he always felt the same quiet awe. This was his kingdom of sound, a place of echoes, emptiness, and devotion. To an untrained eye, the act of ringing a bell seemed simple: a pull, a swing, a sound. But to the ringer, it was an art. The rope was his instrument. It was worn smooth by years of hands. He knew its feel the way a musician knows the strings of his lute. Each bell had its own weight, its own resistance. To start the swing was like waking an animal. Careful, coaxing, never rushed. Too much force, and the bell would rebel, slamming against the frame, cracking the yoke. Too little, and it would not find its voice. He began with small pulls, feeling the tension build, the bronze move slightly, the rope hum beneath his fingers. Then, with a steady rhythm, he let the bell swing freely, a long arc of motion, each return a heartbeat. When the clappers struck, The sound filled the tower, vibrating through his bones, pressing against his chest like a living thing. Outside, the note spread, pure and round, carrying through mist and roof and field. Inside, he stood in silence between strokes, the only witness to the meeting of metal and air. Every ringer developed his own rhythm, a private language written not in sound but in motion. Some pulled sharply, others gently. Some liked the bell to swing fully, others preferred it half-swung, producing a slower, deeper tone. The pattern of his ringing could reveal who he was. Old townspeople would hear from afar and say, "That's Martin tonight. He lets the bell breathe between tolls," or "That must be young Pierre. His pull is too quick. He's eager in this way." The ringer was known through sound, his personality carried on the wind. For weddings, his hands were light and playful. For funerals, slow and heavy. For storms, firm and brave. No words were needed. The bells spoke for him. In larger towns and monasteries, the ringers formed guilds, quiet brotherhoods of sound. They trained apprentices, kept the ropes in repair, and learned the complex patterns of change ringing, where multiple bells were swung in precise sequences to create melodies as intricate as lace. They gathered in the evenings in the small room below the tower, a place of benches, candles, and worn gloves. There they shared bread, spoke of ropes and pulleys, and of the strange joy that came from spending one's life unseen but heard. Some drank small cups of ale before night ringing, believing it steadied the hand. Others prayed silently, believing it steadied the soul. They lived humbly. Few were rich, but all were respected. For in times of celebration or sorrow, it was they who gave voice to the moment. Ringing was work of the whole body. Each motion demanded balance, timing, and grace. To control a bell weighing hundreds of kilograms required not only strength, but intuition. The ringer's arms followed the rope, his feet adjusted to its swing, his body swayed in time with the tower itself. From below, passers-by might see only the rope moving, but above, it was a kind of dance, a slow, deliberate waltz between man and sound. In cold weather, breath misted around him, and his hands stiffened until the rope burned them raw. In summer, sweat dripped from his brow, and the dust of the tower clung to his skin. Yet, when the last toll faded, he often stood still for a long time, breathing deeply, listening to the echo fade into silence. That silence was part of the music, too. Young apprentices began with sweeping the tower stairs, oiling the gears, and cleaning the pigeon nests. They learned the names of each bell, their weights, their moods. Only after months of observation were they allowed to touch the rope. The first time they pulled, the bell barely moved, a tiny tremor, a whisper of sound. The older ringers watched, nodding with half smiles. "Patience," they said. "You don't command the bell, you invite it." With time, the apprentice learned to sense the invisible weight above, to feel how motion traveled through air and rope, to pull not with muscle, but with rhythm. The day he first rang the bell alone, his hands shook with joy. For that moment, he was part of something larger, a lineage of sound stretching back centuries. The bell ringers were rarely mentioned in records. Their names appeared only in small parish ledgers or in faded notes beside the names of priests and sacristans. But without them, the world would have fallen silent. They were the keepers of rhythm, the guardians of sound. They knew the mood of the bell like a friend's. They could tell when it was tired, when the clapper needed repair, when the frame creaked from humidity. Some lived their entire lives within the same tower, hearing the same tone from youth to old age. When they died, the other ringers tolled the bell for them. a final gesture of brotherhood. The sound seemed heavier then, as if the bell itself understood. When a bell swings, it breathes. The air rushes through its mouth and over its rim. Each motion pulls and releases the wind. The ringer feels it on his skin, a pulse of invisible force. Some said this was the bell's soul moving through him. Others said it was the spirit of prayer made tangible. To stand within that breath was to feel alive in a way few ever did. Not as a master of sound, but as its vessel. Every strike of the clapper echoed through his bones. And in that vibration, he sensed the presence of everyone listening below. The baker pausing his kneading, the mother at her window, the child looking up in wonder. He could not see them, but he could feel them. Their silence was the other half of his song. Some nights he was called to ring after sunset, for vigils, for storms, for prayer. The climb by lantern light was lonelier then. The town below was dark, and the only other light came from stars. The tower felt alive, wood groaning, ropes sighing, the bell a vast shadow above. When he rang at night, the sound traveled farther. It seemed to float, sliding over rooftops and rivers, carried by cool air into the countryside. Sometimes he paused between peals just to listen to the echo roll away. It was like hearing his own thoughts drift into eternity. And when he descended, the quiet of the church seemed deeper, the candles smaller, the world softer than before. Beyond the stone walls of cities, beyond the crowded markets and towers of iron and prayer, the land opens. It stretches wide and breathing, meadows dotted with cottages, lanes lined with poplars, streams turning silver in the light. Here the sound of a bell is different. It does not strike walls or echo through narrow streets. It floats. It drifts over fields, over sheep and wheat and quiet ponds, crossing miles of open air before it fades. In the countryside, a bell's voice is both lonelier and more profound. A single tone rising from a chapel half hidden in trees, its echo caught by the hills and sent back, so that it seems the whole landscape is answering. Every village, no matter how small, had a bell. Some hung from wooden frames above humble chapels, some from crooked towers built of stone and lime. They were rarely grand, often cast by wandering founders, rough in shape, sometimes chipped or cracked, yet their sound was unmistakably human. In the early morning, when the mist lay low and the earth smelled of dew and cattle, the bell rang for lauds, the morning prayer. Farmers paused at their thresholds, wives lifted eyes from their work, and children turned their faces toward the sound, even if they could not yet see the chapel through the fog. The tone was softer than that of city bells. Its ring carried less power, but more intimacy. It was the voice of a neighbor, not a ruler. And when the fog cleared, you could see the little building standing solitary among trees, a white wall, a wooden cross, a patch of wildflowers at its base. Each sound it made reminded people that, even in remote places, they were part of a world larger than their field, larger than the season, larger than the silence. In river valleys, the sound behaved strangely. It slid along water like silk. One bell could be heard for miles downstream, its note rising and falling with the flow. Fishermen said they could tell how far they were from home by how clear or faint the bell sounded through the mist. Sometimes, two villages faced one another across a wide river. Their bells rang almost in conversation, one answering the other, the gap between tones carried by water. To those rowing at dawn, it was like hearing two friends greet each other through fog. Even now, in the early hours of certain valleys, if the wind is right, you can still hear faint overlapping echoes. as if old bells, long melted or fallen silent, were still talking across the centuries. High on the hills, where no tower stood and no chapel's shadow reached, there were other bells, smaller, humbler, tied to the necks of animals. Sheep bells, cow bells, goat bells, the music of the open fields. Each made a different sound, some high and tinkling, others deep and muffled, each as distinct as the creature that carried it. When the wind blew, 1,000 little notes floated together, like a scattered orchestra of gentle tones. To a traveler walking the ridge at sunset, this chorus was the sound of peace, the rhythm of a world that asked for nothing, that simply was. The shepherd sat among them, listening without needing to count or speak. He knew his flock by ear, the way a ringer knows his bells. If one sound was missing, he would rise and look for it, guided not by sight, but by absence. Far from towns, hidden between forests or perched on cliffs, stood the monasteries, places where time slowed almost to stillness. Their bells were few but pure. A single tone might rise at dawn, ringing over miles of wilderness. The monks within would stop their labor, lay down their tools, and bow their heads. The sound was not only a summons, it was a prayer in itself, a vibration through the air that sanctified even silence. Travelers passing nearby often stopped in their tracks. Some crossed themselves instinctively, others simply listened, their faces turned toward the invisible sound. For them, that tone meant safety. Where there was a bell, there were people. Where there were people, there was bread, warmth, and refuge. It was said that the ring of a monastic bell could be heard not only by the living, but by the angels who walked the forests unseen. In wide farmlands, some bells were not tied to churches at all. They stood alone, mounted on wooden poles near barns or crossroads. These were the field bells, practical and yet somehow sacred. They marked the beginning and end of labor, the start of harvest, the warning of storms. They called workers to meals and children home at dusk. The farmer's wife, standing at the threshold, would pull the rope at noon. The sound rolled gently across wheat, and men straightened their backs, grateful for rest. Each ring was short, but it carried affection, a human sound amid the long quiet of the fields. Sometimes, in the golden light of evening, the bell rang again to mark the day's end. Birds settled, the oxen were led in, and the world seemed to breathe out. That tone, fading into the horizon, was a lullaby for the land itself. Sound travels differently across distance. When one village rang its bell, another might answer, not by design, but by habit. A ripple of connection carried through miles of open air. It was said that neighboring towns learned to tell time by each other's bells. If you lived halfway between two villages, you could measure your day by the conversation between them, the first striking the hour, the second replying moments later. The hills amplified the pattern, turning two voices into a chorus. For travelers moving through the countryside, this overlapping sound was like a compass. Even without knowing the road, they could follow the bells to human warmth. In the countryside, people swore that bells changed with the weather. On cold, clear mornings, they sounded bright and sharp. On damp days, their tone deepened, melancholy and slow. Fishermen along the coast listened to the pitch of the church bell to predict fog or wind. Farmers said they could hear storms in the tremor of distant sound. It was not superstition so much as intimacy, a lifetime spent listening until the voice of metal and air became as familiar as one's own heartbeat. There were moments, however, when the land fell silent. In winter, heavy snow muffled everything. The bell would still ring, but its sound sank quickly into the white air, as though the world were swallowing it whole. At such times, the silence was almost holy, not the silence of absence, but of rest. People said that in deep snow, you could stand beside the church itself and hear the bell not with your ears, but with your chest. A low vibration, a warmth through the cold. The bells taught people that even silence had sound, if only one listened deeply enough. On Sundays, the rural bells rang longer. They rang for faith, but also for gathering, for meeting faces unseen all week. The villagers walked for miles around, their boots muddy, their clothes smelling faintly of soil and smoke. Children carried baskets of herbs. Old men leaned on sticks. Dogs trotted at their sides. The sound of the bell guided them, like a thread of gold leading through fields and hedgerows. When they reached the church, they found others waiting, neighbors, friends, strangers, who felt less strange because they too had followed the same sound. And when the bell stopped, it was replaced by laughter, voices, and the quiet shuffle of shared prayer. The bell had gathered them as easily as gravity gathers stars. There were even smaller bells. Bells hung not on towers, but in farmhouses themselves. A thin rope near the hearth, a small bronze shape above the door. It rang to mark the meal, to call the family in from fields, to warn of fire. It was domestic, but it carried the same dignity as any cathedral bell. In its small ring, there was safety, a rhythm of belonging. And when visitors arrived on dusty roads, they often heard it long before seeing the house, a simple sound that said, "You have reached home." Every sound carries meaning. But in the Middle Ages, meaning was not only heard, it was believed. A bell was never just a bell. It was a presence, a boundary between the seen and unseen, a guardian voice that spoke where no human dared. For those who lived in the half-light of faith and fear, the ringing of a bell was both prayer and spell, a voice that kept the shadows away. The belief began with the metal itself. Bronze, the union of copper and tin, was thought to contain power, a balance of elements, one red and fiery, the other pale and calm. When melted together in the forge, they created something greater, a substance both strong and resonant, half of earth, half of spirit. The moment a bell was cast and blessed, it ceased to be an object and became a protector. It was said that demons feared the sound of sanctified bronze, for it reminded them of the divine voice they had lost. Some chroniclers claimed that when a new bell rang for the first time, evil spirits fled the village in clouds of black smoke. Others swore they saw ravens scatter at the very first toll. The people believed, and that belief gave every note its strength. Bells were not simply made, they were baptized. This rite, called the Benedictio Campanarum, was one of the most solemn ceremonies of the church. The priest washed the bell with holy water and wine, anointed it with oil, and gave it a name. He prayed that its sound might drive away storms, heal the sick, calm the winds, and gladden the hearts of the faithful. Incense was burned beneath it. The bell was clothed in white linen, as though it were a living being ready for its first breath. To the people watching below, it was a moment of birth. The bell was no longer a thing, but a soul of metal. From that day onward, they believed it could intercede with heaven itself. But not all bells were good. Legends told of those cast without blessing, or forged with impure metal, or baptized in secret by wicked hands. Such bells were said to speak in wrong tones, discordant, mournful, as though mocking the holy sound of others. In the Chronicles of Burgundy, one abbey wrote of a black bell that tolled by itself on nights of misfortune. When it rang, someone in the village always died before morning. In Bohemia, there was said to be a bell that refused to ring on Easter Sunday, no matter how many ropes were pulled. But on the eve of storms, it would swing on its own, crying out like a trapped animal. Priests called such bells accursed and ordered them broken and buried in the ground. Yet farmers whispered that the earth still hummed faintly where those bells were laid. Few sounds were more closely tied to death than bells. The passing bell, rung as a soul departed, was believed to frighten demons that gathered at the bedside. The vibration of sanctified metal, they said, cut through the veil between worlds. Even after death, the bell continued to speak for the departed. Each toll marked their journey through purgatory, a steady rhythm of prayer that guided them onward. In some villages, the tolling continued for days, so that the sound itself seemed to mourn. When great men died, kings, abbots, saints, the bells of every nearby church joined together, their combined sound rolling over the land like the sigh of heaven. People listened from their windows, counting the strokes, and whispered, "The angels will find the soul more easily tonight." There were stories of bells that showed emotion. In one tale from the Alps, a bell wept tears of dew each year on the anniversary of its founder's death. Another, from the Rhineland, spoke of a bell that cracked during a famine because it could not bear the sound of hungry children crying beneath its tower. These stories were told not as fantasy, but as truth. For the medieval mind believed the boundary between life and object was thin. Everything that existed could feel. Everything that spoke could love or mourn. To them, the bell was not merely a symbol of devotion, it was a heart that could break. Bells were also said to heal. The sick were brought near the tower so that their fevered bodies might feel the vibrations. The sound was thought to cleanse the air, to shake away sickness as wind shakes leaves from trees. During plagues, bells rang not only to announce death, but to drive disease itself from the air. Priests called this fumigatio sonora, the purification by sound. In Italy, mothers dipped cloths in the water that had washed a new bell, then placed them on their children's foreheads to protect against illness. In France, people made small amulets shaped like bells and wore them around their necks as charms against fever. Each ring was a prayer for endurance, each vibration a promise of survival. We have already heard of ringers who climbed towers to defy lightning. But beyond courage, there was ritual. Before ringing, the ringer made the sign of the cross over the rope. He sprinkled holy water on the floor of the tower and spoke a short invocation. As this sound ascends, may the storm be silenced. When thunder struck, he believed the bell itself absorbed the fury, turning it into harmony. People watching from below saw not folly, but faith. For in those days, sound was the only weapon against the sky. In many countries, bells were believed to protect against witchcraft. During the witching hour, between midnight and 1, villagers sometimes rang a small handbell called the saint's tongue to keep away spirits wandering the lanes. It was said that witches could not cross the shadow of a ringing bell. On certain feast days, when bonfires burned and dances filled the fields, the bell was rung 3 times before midnight to seal the circle, a sound wall that no evil could breach. Even today, some church bells bear inscriptions that read, "Fulgura frango," I break the lightning; "Demonis fugo," I flee the demons; "Mortuos plango," I mourn the dead; "Vivos voco," I call the living. The medieval mind saw no contradiction in this magic. The sacred and the supernatural were not opposites, they were neighbors. Some bells, it was said, could foretell the future. In Spain, one ancient bell was believed to ring before war. In England, another was heard at sea before storms sank ships. The people did not fear these sounds. They accepted them, as if the world itself occasionally needed to speak. A bell that rang without hands was called autophonous, self-sounding. Its voice was considered a message from God or a warning from the dead. Even skeptics paused to listen. For no one, however learned, could explain why certain towers rang when no human touched them. There were tales of bells that traveled. During wars, when churches were looted, people said the bells escaped by flying through the air, returning to their sanctuaries when peace returned. In Italy, it was believed that on Holy Saturday, all the bells of Christendom flew to Rome to receive blessing from the Pope, returning on Easter morning laden with gifts for children, hence the custom of sweets and eggs dropped from the sky. Children waited on hillsides, listening for faint tones in the clouds. Even as adults, many never stopped listening. The bell's voice changed with the moon. During full moons, it was said to ring clearer, its tone silvered by the light. On new moons, the sound dulled, as though even metal obeyed the rhythm of the heavens. Farmers used moonlight and bell together to time their planting and harvests. They swore that when both aligned, a clear night and a bright bell, the crops would flourish. And if the bell cracked under a full moon, it was not seen as misfortune, but as a sign that heaven had spoken through it. There are ruins now, in fields and forests, where bells lie half buried, their inscriptions worn away. Yet, on certain nights, locals claim to hear them still. A faint sound beneath the wind, not loud enough to wake, but enough to make one pause. They say these are the ghost bells, the memories of sound. Somewhere between imagination and truth, their tone lingers. Proof that what once rang for faith and fear never truly falls silent. After 1,000 years of ringing, of bronze and air and faith, the bells began to fall silent. One by one, across towns and valleys, their ropes were cut, their towers emptied, their voices forgotten. It did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, like a long breath being held. The people who had lived their lives by sound awoke one morning to find silence in its place. And that silence was not peace. It was absence. The 16th century was an age of questioning. Kings and scholars, priests and poets, all began to ask what had never before been asked aloud. They questioned relics, indulgences, saints, and miracles. And in their questioning, they came to question the bells. If salvation could not be bought, could it be rung? If heaven was not reached through intercession, what did the toll of bronze mean anymore? To some, the bells were symbols of the old world, of superstition, of control, of fear. To others, they remained the heartbeat of the community, the last link between earth and eternity. The argument between silence and sound divided not only churches, but souls. When the Reformation came, its first act was not the printing of words, but the silencing of voices. Monasteries were dissolved, abbeys emptied, and in their towers, the bells that had once marked the hours of prayer were struck dumb. In some towns, the bells were lowered and melted, their bronze reborn as cannon, their sanctified tones turned into instruments of war. In others, they were left hanging but forbidden to ring. Dust gathered on their lips. Birds nested where once there had been music. And at night, when the wind moved through the empty towers, the people said they could still hear the faint trembling of memory, a sound without source, a ghost of what had been. The Reformation was not gentle. It was fire and hammer. In England, under King Henry VIII, the great monasteries were stripped of their wealth. Their bells, hundreds of them, were ordered to be melted. One chronicler wrote that, in the space of a few years, more sweet sound was destroyed than England had ever known. In Germany and the Low Countries, iconoclasts stormed churches, tearing down statues and breaking altars. The bells, too, were seen as idols, their sound a deception of the senses. They were pulled from towers and hurled into courtyards. Their bronze was weighed, measured, sold to merchants and smiths. Some were recast into plowshares, some into guns, some into coins that passed from hand to hand. Their sacred past forgotten. But there were stories of those who refused to let go. In one small Flemish town, villagers buried their bell beneath the church floor to save it from confiscation. For centuries afterward, they said that on certain feast days, you could hear it ring beneath the earth. For monks and nuns, the bell had been life itself. It told them when to rise, when to eat, when to pray, when to sleep. When their bells were taken, time lost its shape. The rhythm of centuries ended overnight. A chronicler from an English priory wrote, "When the tower ceased, we did not know if it was day or dream." Some monks carried small handbells with them into exile, ringing them softly in secret, so that prayer might continue even without a tower. But most learned to live without sound. They spoke of the silence as if it were a wound, not bleeding, but deep. In many towns, one church turned Protestant, the other remained Catholic. Their bells became voices in argument. At dawn, one would ring for matins, at dusk, the other for evening sermon. The air itself became contested ground. Children grew up knowing which sound meant us and which meant them. Sometimes, the bells rang at the same time, their tones clashing in midair, a strange, mournful dissonance that spoke more truth than any sermon could. It was the sound of faith divided against itself. As decades passed, new ideas filled the silence. Reason replaced ritual. Science replaced mystery. Time, once measured by bells, was now kept by clocks. The first public timepieces appeared in the towers of reformed cities, mechanical, precise, tireless. They ticked instead of told. They spoke in numbers instead of echoes. To many, this was progress. To others, it was loss. For the bell had been imperfect, but human. It breathed, it varied, it was alive. The clock was flawless, but cold. And so, in that quiet, a new kind of world was born. A world that counted, but did not listen. Not all were silenced. In hidden valleys, remote monasteries, and old Catholic kingdoms, the bells continued to ring. They rang for the old feasts, the old prayers, the old names of saints long forbidden elsewhere. Sometimes, their sound drifted across borders, where listeners paused, startled, as though hearing an extinct language spoken again. To the faithful, these bells were relics of continuity, proof that the world's heart still beat beneath the noise of change. In secret Catholic villages of England, farmers used coded patterns of ringing to mark Mass held in barns or woods. A slow single toll at dawn meant come. 3 sharp strikes meant go safely. A double echo at dusk meant peace. In this way, the old bell became resistance itself, its sound an act of faith in defiance of silence. But silence, too, became sacred. When the old sounds faded, people began to hear what had been hidden beneath them. The whisper of leaves, the pulse of the river, the creak of wooden beams, the beating of their own hearts. Writers spoke of this as a second revelation, a quieter form of listening. They realized that the divine did not reside only in bronze and echo, but also in stillness. The bell had been a teacher. Its absence became another. For the founders, the craftsmen who shaped molten bronze into song, the Reformation was ruin. Workshops closed, furnaces went cold. Men who had once poured their skill into sound now made weapons instead. Some refused. One foundry in Cologne was said to have hidden its molds, burying them under floorboards until better times returned. Their apprentices grew old without ever hearing the fruit of their hands ring in the air. In their dreams, they still heard the tones they never cast. Imaginary bells, perfect and unreachable. Decades passed, then centuries. Whole generations were born into silence, knowing bells only from stories told by elders. To them, the idea of a town that lived by sound seemed strange, almost mythic, a relic of another age. And yet, in some places, the memory lingered like an ember. Old women still crossed themselves at the sight of a tower. Children still played at ringing imaginary ropes. The silence had not erased the bell, only transformed it into longing. In the 17th century, some of the old bells were recast and raised again. Not for saints or relics this time, but for civic pride, for harvest, for community. Their new songs were not of salvation, but of identity. The people had changed, but the sound had not. When the first of these reformed bells rang again, the townsfolk wept openly. The tone was the same as their ancestors had heard. Deep, patient, alive. It no longer belonged to heaven. It belonged to them. And perhaps that was what the bell had always meant. To remind humans not of what ruled above, but of what connected below. The story of the bells does not end with silence. For even when their towers crumble, even when their ropes fray and their names are forgotten, something of them remains. Sound leaves traces. It lingers in stone, in air, in the folds of memory. The world, having once been full of bells, will never be truly quiet again. If you listen carefully, not with your ears, but with that inward hearing that comes only in stillness, you may find that their echoes have simply gone deeper, into the heart of things. Across Europe, scattered among hills and rivers, some of the medieval bells still live. They hang in small parish towers, their bronze worn smooth by centuries of sound. Their inscriptions have softened under weather, letters no longer sharp, but legible enough to whisper, Pax vobiscum. Peace be with you. Vivos voco, mortuos plango, fulgura frango. I call the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning. When the rope is pulled, their tone is deep and human, a voice that remembers. In French villages, farmers pause mid-field when they hear it, as their ancestors once did. In Italian valleys, shepherds on the slopes lift their heads to count the noon strokes drifting through the olive groves. In English towns, the bells of cathedrals still mark the hour, not as commands, but as comfort. The same bronze that tolled for plague and coronation, for warning and wedding, still swings in the air, as though time itself were held in its curved shape. After centuries of neglect, some towers were raised again, not as fortresses of faith, but as monuments of memory. Villagers gathered to rebuild them stone by stone. They lifted the bells with ropes, their faces bright with effort, their hands blistered but joyful. When at last the new bell hung in place, a hush fell over the crowd. The priest, or sometimes just the eldest villager, spoke a simple blessing. May this sound remind us who we are. Then the rope was pulled, and the bell sang again. Not to heaven, but to the people themselves. The sound rolled through the valley, waking birds, stirring dust, touching water. It seemed to say, you are still here. The world still breathes. There were darker resurrections, too. During the wars of the 20th century, bells once again faced the furnace. Governments demanded bronze for weapons, and the old cycle repeated. Holy metal turned to arms. In occupied towns, people wept as they watched the cranes lift their bells away. The sound of a single clapper striking one last time was like a farewell. And yet, after the wars ended, the survivors returned. Some bells were recast from fragments, their new inscriptions simple and human. Peace, 1945. Never again, from silence, sound. Their tone was gentler, as though the bronze itself had learned compassion. They no longer rang for saints or kings, they rang for memory. In quiet halls of museums, some bells now stand on display, their clappers still, their mouths open in permanent pause. Visitors walk past, reading the plaques, names, dates, foundries. Children place their hands on the metal, and though it does not move, they feel a kind of vibration. The ghost of sound resting inside. Curators polish them once a year, removing the dust but never the patina. For in that dull green of age lies their dignity, a record of centuries of rain, frost, and touch. Sometimes, when the museum is closed and night settles over the city, the air seems to hum faintly. It is only imagination, perhaps. Or perhaps the bells remembering what they once were. There are bells far from cities, bells that no one hears. In abandoned chapels along the Pyrenees, in crumbling watchtowers by the Black Sea, in forest monasteries where ivy curls around stone. They still hang, motionless but whole. Birds nest inside them. Wind sways their ropes, sometimes striking a faint, accidental tone. For a heartbeat, the forest becomes a church again. And then silence returns, gentle and complete. The bell waits. It has no hurry. Time for it is only the long patience between sounds. After all these centuries, the greatest bells are not made of bronze. They live within us. We carry their rhythm in our bodies, the slow beat of our hearts, the pulse that divides our days into hours, our breaths into prayers. When we speak softly, when we forgive, when we remember the dead, we ring an inner bell. Its sound cannot be recorded. It does not echo in valleys or towers, but it resonates, quietly, through the spaces between people. Thus, the bell's never true today. The sound of bells lives on, in cities, in schools, on ships, in clock towers. Some announce the hour, others mark the beginning and end of classes, of ceremonies, of lives. Even electronic bells imitate them, as if digital time still craves the warmth of human hands pulling on ropes. And though the sound is now recorded, looped, automated, something ancient remains in its rhythm. For the bell, even the artificial one, still reminds us to stop. It still says, this moment is now. Remember it. Memory itself rings like a bell. Every memory begins quietly, a tone that seems to come from nowhere, then grows and fades, leaving silence in its place. When we recall our childhood or a face long gone, we hear the bells of time. They ring not to call us back, but to show us that what is past still vibrates within. The past, like bronze, does not die. It deepens. It waits. Even now, there are still foundries where bells are born. In the workshops of Normandy, Poland, the Netherlands, artisans melt copper and tin, pouring the red-hot metal into molds, as their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. The fire roars, the air smells of smoke and earth, and when the mold breaks, a new bell appears, its surface bright, its sound untested. Before it rings, the doctor always listens silently. Then, with a small hammer, he strikes its rim. A single clear note fills the room, ancient, fragile, alive. Everyone stops what they are doing. No one speaks. In this moment, centuries come together, medieval and modern, alive and memorable. The old sound has returned. There's a legend among the bell ringers that one day, at the end of the world, all the bells will ring at once. The sound will begin as a whisper, then grow until it fills the air, the oceans, the space between the stars. It will be neither joyful nor terrifying, only vast. And in that final vibration, all that was divided will become whole again. Until that day, every bell that rings is a rehearsal, a reminder that unity is possible, even if for a moment, even if only in sound. You have heard their story, from birth to silence, from superstition to science, from bronze to memory. The bells have watched humanity change, and yet their meaning has not faded. They still mark what is sacred, the passage of time, the weight of love, the tenderness of memories. If you listen now, wherever you are, there is a rhythm next to you. It could be the sound of rain, or a heartbeat, or the wind touching glass. It is a bell too. And maybe tonight, after the story's over, when the room is dark and the air is still, you will hear something faint, a low tone deep in the silence, as if the world itself were breathing. Don't be afraid of it. It is only time to ring again, to remind you that you are alive. The bells have done their work. Before we part, please remember to subscribe, leave a quiet comment, perhaps tell me where you are listening from tonight. Your words join this slow music of echoes and dreams. Good night, dear listener. May your sleep be peaceful, and may the bells, internal and external, continue to ring gently in your heart lie ended. They simply moved within us.